The day I have warned has come to pass. We have entered Superman in the 1950s. And as I threatened, we are going to do a video explaining what was happening in the comic book industry during the 50s because I find this very fascinating, but I do believe we need some sort of context to what's going on. And the 50s are a very specific decade. Now, when it comes to comic book history, comic book historians tend to steal other names or concepts from history to use in comic history. So for example, the beginning of comic books, like with the publishing of Superman and superhero comic history, is the Golden Age. The Golden Age lasts from like 1938 till the 1960s. The 60s are the Silver Age, 70s are the Bronze Age, and in the middle of the 1980s, with the publishing of Batman The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, you have the modern age. And the modern age is almost 40 years old at this point. So at some point we might need to change these up. Maybe not, because in a lot of ways, and you can do this with the previous eras, you can talk about a comic during a certain specific era as to what was going on in the comic, like Brand New Day, or events, which is much easier to talk about once we get into the modern day, as there was a lot of events, like an event coming out every year, and some of them have like lasting consequences. So you then have like a post and pre-crisis. Everything is before pre-crisis right now because crisis doesn't happen until the modern age. Of course, the new 52, and it's really hard to go from the modern age to, say, a postmodern age. What would a postmodern comic book be? A book on carpet samples? Note to self, this sounds like an interesting scam. No one steal it. So I will be doing a video on these different eras, but I don't know if I'm going to be talking as much as I will be on the Golden Age. Now, some comic book historians, not all, also refer to the modern age as the start of the Dark Ages because due to the two comics I listed being very dark comics, which is not the main reasons why they're good and changed the industry, the entertainment industry, as it tends to do, here meaning comics, learns the wrong lessons from it, so they want dark comics, and that became unsustainable, which is true for a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. It could not be sustained. And things just got really bad, and just because a story is dark doesn't make it good. You can tell a good story that's light, but it was just so bad. Like, you can actually argue that the 90s themselves are a dark age, or 2003 DC. 2003 DC also had some highs, but man, those lows will stay with me. What was I talking about? But I find this too literal of the use of Dark Ages, and if we want to keep with like the theme of the Dark Ages, which is a time where not a lot of literature is coming out in the sense of how English majors like to talk about it. This is coming from my history major, well, degree holder wife and her views on the Dark Ages. But so the Dark Ages are a great time for like Western history, specifically European history, when it comes to English art made in literature. There's some actually pretty good other types of art being made, but mathematics and science. Now, this wasn't a whole Dark Ages for everybody in the history. In fact, the Middle East is doing a lot to the things I have just mentioned. In fact, we wouldn't have certain kind of mathematics or progressions in science if the Middle East hadn't kept on with that during those times. But it got named the Dark Ages. And if we want to point to a conservative, creatively barren time for comics, I would give it to the 1950s. So this is my attempt to try to claim the 1950s as the Dark Ages. I'm trying to define it that way. And if you don't agree, go ahead with that. You're wrong, but if you don't agree, doesn't mean this will ever be taken seriously by anyone, and I don't expect it to. It also just kind of makes me happy because all the rest of the ages are around a decade long, and right now the Golden Age is like 2 decades long, so it narrows it down a bit. Also, of these medals being named, like the Golden Age makes the most sense because you understand what golden is. It's sort of this nostalgic, rose-tinted era. Like, you kind of understand what that means. Though you understand, if you follow comics, what the Silver Age means, there's something very silver about that era. So we get started where the only natural place to start when we're talking about the 1950s is 1950-45. Yeah, that natural starting point. The reason we have to start in the mid-40s is there's something happening in comics that is leading to what ends up happening in the 50s. The 50s is not a good era for comics. Bad decade, bad decade. But it starts in the mid-40s, and I brought this up in my What We Learn About the First 10 Years of Superman video, but something was going on in the late 40s, which starts in 45. You see, comics had a bit of a crash. It's not doing great financially. And there's a lot of reasons for this, there generally are, and then there's like one big reason for it, or the straw that breaks the camel's back. So like televisions are starting to appear, and that's sort of hurting some of the readership, but like the 50s are a bigger year for televisions. It's not as huge as it's going to be. A better signifier is that there's an oversaturation of the market. You see a lot of people get into comics hearing how much money like Superman is making and want to make that money. So there's just a glut of companies and characters being created that are forgotten by history. My favorite to bring up from this time is the Red Bee. Red Bee was a scientist who shot trained bees out of a gun. By the way, he's in the public domain, so any of us can write Red Bee stories. So I say we all write a Red Bee story and see who has the best one next week. And then I will steal that idea and make a lot of money. But there's so many other heroes and villains that have been forgotten at this time. I recommend reading John Morris's The League of Regrettable Superheroes, half-baked heroes from comic book history, if you want to learn more about the forgotten heroes. I have read it, but I can't remember most of them. But this is to say, there's a lot of not good stuff coming out that's hurting the marketplace, and eventually this is going to have implications and consequences if you're just shoving out any old crap. And if you haven't already figured it out, the big thing that happens in 1945 is the end of World War II. Or you can just say World War II in general, but it's the end that's the problem. And it's weird to say the end of World War II is a negative, unless we're talking about nuclear proliferation. Then that's a totally fair point. But you see, comics are pretty prevalent in the war, not just in the US, but with servicemen, soldiers. They are reading a lot of comics. A lot of comics are being shipped out there. Now, DC, in their documentary from about a decade ago, claimed that about 10% of what was sent over in USO care packages were comic books. I've tried to look this up and cannot confirm it, but it's safe to say that there was quite a bit of comics going over. This makes sense. They're not very precious. They're printed on like the cheapest paper stock, which is why they don't exist anymore. A lot of the Golden Age comics, even if you were trying to keep them in very good condition, they're just not built to last, especially when you're giving them to mostly children. It also doesn't help during World War II. They were asking for some supplies, like donate a whole bunch of paper, so parents took the opportunity to take all their kids' comic books and send them away. This is why they're all very rare. So many factors. And it makes sense about the comic book because it's not very heavy. It's not very precious. You can basically fold it up and put it in your bag without adding weight. Compared to a book, you might want to, say, keep the book safer, maybe just by a little bit. And if you're like your whole platoon has a different comic book, you can just be trading that. Like, this is a net good. Like, I'm not saying this is a bad thing at all, which is funny because this leads to a bad thing, but this was a good idea. And there were definitely more adult men reading comic books than anyone would admit. Yes, it's written for children, but definitely men in their late teens who are out more, and 20-year-olds, and even some 30 and 40-year-olds, possibly even higher, are reading comic books. But the unforeseen consequence of this is they then associate comics with wartime conditions. So when the war ends and they come back, they want nothing to do with comic books, which is not, say, the most mentally healthy way to deal with that, but it's the 1940s, so we're not going to acknowledge that. Yeah, we're not going to acknowledge that, but a lot of mental health is going to come up in this video. Oddly, a theme in the 40s and 50s. Who would have known? Not them, they weren't paying attention to it. But you can understand why they don't want to read comics. So with everything else happening, essentially overnight, a large percentage of the readership goes away, causing a massive downturn. Most of those companies and forgotten heroes go away. DC buys a lot of them over the time. There are so many characters that exist in the DC universe because DC bought the rights to them that they don't do anything with. If you ever watched the animated Justice League Unlimited, this is where a lot of those background characters who sometimes came to the forefront are from. Not all of them, but a lot of them. I think they actually owned the Red Bee for a while, because he was in James Robinson's Ode to the Golden Age and Great 90s comic Starman. He appeared in one of the yearly Dream Death stories, where Starman would have a dream with a bunch of Golden Age dead superheroes. Though he may have just been in the public domain at the time. That was the last time I remember reading the Red Bee in a comic. I know they've tried to reinvent him a few times. This downturn essentially kills everybody, ends their comics, except for Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. They are able to stand out and sustain themselves. So this includes the original Jay Garrick Flash, the original Alan Scott Green Lantern, and of course Captain America. Even Captain America ends. Though he does come back in the 50s, no matter how much Marvel tries to rewrite and retcon. Retcon means retroactive continuity. It means changing something retroactively. So the 1950s Captain America gets explained away as being someone else, because even by the 1960s, Marvel's like, yeah, that Captain America wasn't good. We're kind of embarrassed about the 1950s Captain America, which thematically works for the 1950s. It's kind of hilarious. And comics are struggling, though they do gain some stability as we're going into the 1950s. As I mentioned, they've cut back on content, but more ads in the Superman comics. And this maybe has nothing to do with anything, but I'm going to talk about it anyways because I find it interesting. Stan Lee was basically in charge of Time Weekly's comic book publishing at the time. Well, he was managing the characters and the comics. And he was doing something very good because he was afraid of another downturn. He was basically banking stories. He was keeping writers and staff and artists hired on payroll to make comics, but he wasn't publishing them all. He was putting them in a cabinet in his office, just in case. So this kept a lot of people employed. But then Martin Goodman, who was in charge of the entire publishing and related to Stan Lee through marriage, most of the people who worked for Goodman Publishing were, and Stan Lee, yes, got his job due to nepotism, found out about this and demanded that he publish all the comics he was banking before he was allowed to publish anything new, which then made all these writers, artists, and staff who needed work at this time, because it's not easy to find work in comics right now, out of luck. And it said when Jack Kirby was told, he hung up the phone and said he would never work with Stan Lee again. Luckily, he doesn't hold to that, and they go on to co-create the Marvel Universe, though Jack Kirby will be slighted by Stan Lee many more times over history. And as we get into the 50s, tastes change as you expect them to do. So romance comics become very big at this time. Literally a comic called Love Comics, written by Captain America co-creators Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Yes, that Jack Kirby. This is when Archie starts to become popular, a comic that for some reason has this long-lasting comic that's about a klutzy, orange-haired dork who can't decide between the rich, spoiled brunette who is sometimes awful to him, or the all-American girl next door blonde who seems to be absolutely adoring towards him at most times. And of course, his best friend who is really obsessed with hamburgers. I was going to make a joke about his sexuality being hamburgers, but I feel like that would be misconstrued. Also, some of you would have complained to me about the Chip Zdarsky run revealing he was asexual, though I believe the very next writer did not hold to that. But what you need to know about Jughead is he really loves hamburgers, and there's almost nothing else to that character for a lot of stories. And this comic runs up until like 10 to 15 years ago, when Archie and all his friends grown up comic dies saving a friend from assassination. And as he dies, he's looking up at both Betty and Veronica and says, "I love you," not making it clear who he's talking to, which is hilarious and a massive cop-out. He was never going to make a choice, which is why it would have been a better payoff if Betty and Veronica would have just simply let him go and dated each other, because that's funny. Look, he couldn't make a decision in 70 years. He deserves it. But there is a storm brewing as we get further into the 50s, and technically it will hit in 1954, but I'm not going to wait to do a video in 1954, and yeah, I know it's not encompassing the 50s, But like the Silver Age doesn't exactly start on January 1st, 1960 or 1961, however you want to define that. But it does define the 50s of comics. And that is with the publication of Seduction of the Innocent. So now I have to talk about Frederick Wortham and the bad book he wrote that caused a bit of a moral panic. I always love saying the name Wortham. Now, to sort of understand the time, there was a bit of a rise in adolescent violence and criminal behavior going into the 50s and in the early 50s, which people were looking for reasons to explain. And here's the thing, there is no easy answer. It's very complicated issues involving many factors that changes case by case. Like, we can point to several of them. I am not a medical health professional, but once again, it is complicated. And anybody giving you a simplistic catch-all answer is in no way being helpful to you or your child. In fact, following their advice might in fact just hurt things more because you're not dealing with the actual issue. Seduction of the Innocents is entirely a catch-all, easy answer. Wortham blames everything on comics. And this is where this video is going to get a bit messy, because no matter how many times I have recited this or have written it and edited it, I lose focus. There was just so much to talk about when it comes to Seduction of the Innocent, which up until a year ago I had never read. I had just heard what was in the book, but now I am a bit of an authority of what's happening in this book. And it's not great. And there's going to be tangents that you're really not going to like. I'm going to be called woke or something. I don't care, but I can go on any rant I want. It's my video. So we have to talk about Frederick Wortham. Frederick Wortham was a German-born psychologist who mainly worked at juvenile halls and mental health facilities that had mostly adolescents. He was working at a juvenile hall in upstate New York when he is writing this. He was already pretty well known to comic book professionals because he was one of the biggest critics at the time. He had written many op-eds, he had thrown himself into several issues, appearing in the media, and had written many papers on the issue, blaming comics for pretty much any issue of today's world. By today's world, I mean 1950s world, or 40s. Now, I have to say something good about Wortham, which is going to be hard for me, because, like, his name is perfect to say with absolute loathing. Wortham. Wortham. Now, Wortham, before this, Wortham's research gets quoted in Brown versus the Board of Education. You know, the Supreme Court case that ended segregation. He was involved in that. That is a net good. That is something good he did. But I'm really worried about reading those studies, because even though he was fighting for something that was, you know, historically correct, judging by Seduction of the Innocent, I really worry about his evidence. You see, when it comes to the scientific process and scientific research, especially if you're like a psychologist in any of the scientific fields, medical field, you tend to publish papers for peer review. Peer review is a good system. It's not a great system, but it's a good system, and generally sucks to be peer reviewed, because everyone I've known who has been, including former professors and friends, it's generally not much of an ego boost. You're essentially giving out what is supposed to be a well-researched paper of your belief, theory, study to the rest of the scientific community, specifically in your emphasis, and try to find holes in it. Well, that's not actively, but they are kind of looking at it in a critical eye. So this, in some way, altogether, they can share research and help progress the scientific community. A lot of times, papers that are peer-reviewed are going to get destroyed. Just as maybe there's something important about it, maybe there's something good in it that is found and can be used by somebody else who then progresses things, but it is a major part in the scientific community. Now, as an example, I'm about to talk about climate change and global cooling. So yeah, you're all going to love this. So peer review is very important when you need to understand what exactly was happening at that time, especially when it comes to a scientific consensus. And if you're at all familiar with any of the arguments against climate change, or have watched any conservative media or a certain conservative comedian who was supposedly funny at some time, though there's some debate on that, they like to talk about global cooling. You see, in the 70s, there was a Newsweek article published about global cooling, which some scientists, some being the operative word, thought was a possibility, mainly because the 1970s was a cooler than average decade. This was then picked up by the media, which makes sense because I have a degree in journalism. You kind of want to report on things that have some sort of an issue that people will watch. So, especially if you can make people afraid, like what chemicals in your house could possibly kill you, they then will ramp this up for the whole episode and then tell you at the end, and it's very clearly a chemical you probably shouldn't be drinking. So they got you to watch for the ratings, especially bad in local. And yeah, everything's cold right now, and there is a sect of climatologists who are saying that things are getting cooler, and that might be bad. And this, depending on who you're watching, is used as an argument that scientists don't know what the hell they're talking about. Scientists are making things up. Scientists are flip-floppers, yada, yada, yada. You get whatever answer you want. Or all of them if you want. But nothing too specific. Just leave it for you to decide. The issue with using global cooling is that's not really the fact. If you look at the peer review at that time, and why I said some was the objective word, is there was really a niche group of climatologists. At best, depending on what source you're using for peer review, it has the highest of global cooling papers being published at the time is maybe 20%. They do not do well in peer review. Most of the others are pretty neutral. There are some that show signs of talking about climate change as in global warming. And I know it didn't do well. I don't have to look that up because if it in any way had done well and had become sort of a scientific consensus, which it was not, and that's what's really misleading about the talk about global cooling, is it would still be talked about. That's how science works. Things get into the scientific consciousness. It doesn't just leave if it's being shown to be right. So yeah, immediately when I heard it without looking up the peer review, I'm like, so it probably wasn't very true or make much of a dent, and that's exactly what happened. Compare that to climate change, which has 1,000 more papers being published arguing for it, and that's a conservative estimate. It's probably much higher, and depending on the source you're reading, about 96 to 100% of climatologists do agree. Maybe some facts are wrong in each one, but there seems to be a scientific consensus that there never was with global cooling. But don't worry, there are a few scientists who are trying to disprove it. Though where their money is coming from is a big question. Actually, it's not a question, it's exactly who you think it is, the people who are doing most of the polluting. Also, a lot of these guys are also working in trying to disprove smoking causes cancer and geocentric orbit. What is that, you may ask? Well, that is the belief that the solar system revolves around Earth, a thing that was disproven around the time Galileo invented a telescope. It's actually easy to track without a telescope and was a big hit to the church because it made their argument that we were God's chosen. He created us in the universe for us weaker because we weren't the center of the universe. And that's kind of why they killed Galileo. Like, they didn't kill Galileo because they didn't believe what he was saying. In fact, the church was the most educated group of people due to, power. So they actually understood what he was talking about and knew it was pretty much true. They just asked him to not talk about that, and then he immediately went out and started screaming to everybody how smart he was. So they killed him. After that long rant, we're back to actual peer review when it comes to Wortham, because I know a lot of you are probably thinking psychiatry from the 50s. It's probably not great in general. I mean, this is a time where homosexuality is still listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which it's not anymore. So in general, probably not great at that time, but you'd be wrong, as pretty much the rest of his community, his colleagues and peers, didn't agree with what he was saying. And in fact, the book is sort of out of date from the moment it's published because literally the staff at the place he was working at were outspoken about how he was simplifying things to adolescents who had multiple mental health issues, and in no way was it comics. And his loathing for the others in his field is really palpable. Anytime he talks about anybody else in his community, he refers to them as experts, almost like so-called experts. I don't think he ever says that, but he might. It's been a year since I've read it. But whenever he says experts, And part of this is my own biases towards Wortham, but it is apparent, maybe not to the extreme I'm reading it, that he's being condescending when he's talking about those experts. I don't think that's in any amount of debate that he's being incredibly condescending. Oh my God, it shows. So people with actual psychological degrees have criticized and looked back on Seduction of the Innocents, which, by the way, is very hard to find in print now. I think you can get like used copies from $50 to $100, but you're probably not going to find it at a library. It has not been published. It was not good science. It was terrible science. But the general criticism is that it's all anecdotal evidence. There's not much studies or even facts or figures or evidence. He's mainly interviewing kids anonymously. He's giving us their age, maybe race, sex, but they're basically just telling stories to him, and not great evidence to begin with. Pretty weak, especially when you don't know anything about the kids or any of the circumstances around them. But a lot of the time it reads like the kids are just saying what he wants to hear. Like when you catch a kid doing something wrong and you're like chastising them, and they'll admit what's wrong, but that's just because that's what you want to hear. If they understood that was the problem, they would have never done it in the first place. So there's a lot of times where he asks the kid if he would let like someone younger or a younger sibling read this comic, and they're like, oh God, no. Oh my, why? No, this would scar them. When famously older siblings love to terrorize and are usually the people who introduce younger siblings to horror and other monstrosities. Like, that's just how we are. They're not going to feel bad about it. They know that's what you want to hear, Wortham. So now I'm going to try to focus on some positives. Wortham gets close on 2 separate occasions that I can count. Maybe there's a few other ones I didn't notice, but there's 2 specifically where he ends up missing the forest for the trees. The first is he talks about racism. Now, I get a lot of criticisms about talking about racism in older comics because of the time they were written. But you see, a review is subjective. So as a human being who lives in the modern day, it is completely in my purview to review a comic with my own view. It is entirely subjective. That's what a review is. It is subjective. So whenever someone tries to step over racism problems in media in the past, they're always trying to hand wave it with well, that was just the time. Remember, there were people criticizing these things at the time. You don't get away with that. Wortham is complaining about the racism in comics in the same comics I'm complaining about. Another example is Disney's Song of the South, which did have the NAACP protesting it when it was released. The only thing that really changes is more people listen or care about what's happening, and more people feel safer to be louder or even have those opinions. That's what changed, not some sort of woke mind virus. It's just people feeling safer about their opinions. So he's absolutely right about racism in comics, and yes, something should be done about that. But the problem is he's too worked up on the fact that it's all comics' fault. Because comics learn this from everything else. It is a systemic, it is a societal problem. So just fixing comic books is like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping head wound. It might help for a limited amount of time, but the fact that you're not focusing on racism in a bigger context issue, it's going to show back up, or it's going to find another insidious way to enter comic books. You got to hit the problem. It's a symptom, not the underlying problem. But I want to make it clear that, yeah, you should do something about the racism in comic books. It's fair to criticize. And in fact, one of the stronger bits of anecdotal evidence, as strong as anecdotal evidence can possibly be, is when he's talking to a little African-American girl talking about her experiences and not feeling great reading some racist comic books. That's one of the stronger moments, and unfortunately, he doesn't really talk to her again about any of the other issues. Now, the second one I had higher hopes for, until he, makes a sudden turn off a cliff. Full speed into a fiery abyss where we don't die. It's that insane, is his chapter on comic book ads. And when I'm talking about comic book ads, I'm talking about the ads that used to be in the back of comics They were gone by the time I read comics, but I have definitely read comics from that time that have them. And even if you couldn't read comics like that, they still exist in pop culture. Like, you all probably know the stories of ordering X-ray specs from the back of a comic book that don't work because they're mostly scams. They're trying to unwittingly get some money out of children for things they should not be selling and do not work. Unless that Jay Leno story about the teacup monkey is true. Then there's some legality issues. There was already legality issues, but he apparently actually got a monkey. And his parents weren't happy about the crazy monkey. The monkey wasn't happy to be at this house. But you can see the problem here. He's absolutely right. We should do something about that. It is not a great thing that comics are essentially putting in these scam advertisements to sell to children. Where things go bananas is he decides to focus on acne creams. That is acne, as in pimples, not Acme, the fine purveyors of rocket skates, to help you catch delicious roadrunners. This part of the show is, of course, brought to you by Acme. Acme, try our new roller skates. They are now 0.002% less likely to explode. You can't afford not to buy those roller skates. What the hell am I doing? This is going to be a really bad segue, because what his argument is that teens are buying these pimple creams that don't work, probably all don't work, it's mostly scams back there, and committing suicide because of this. Wortham, I'm going to need some numbers, some statistics. I'm going to need some sort of evidence for this. Now, I'm not saying that a teen somewhere who had tried these acne solutions didn't eventually commit suicide. What I'm saying is suicide, like all of this, is a very complicated subject that involves many factors that are dependent on each person. There is no easy solution to fix it. It is not the pimple cream. And in fact, it is insidious, disingenuous, and just insulting, let alone vapid, to say that teens are committing mass suicide because their pimple treatments don't work. Imagine if you were a parent who were just told this by a so-called expert. Yeah, I'll call him a so-called expert. You are going through one of the worst times in your life, and this man has the audacity to tell you it's because a pimple cream didn't work from a comic book? I feel bad for any parent that had anybody, including this guy, or anyone who had read his works, which did get popular at this time, and have someone tell this to them in their face. Because my God, like, I am legitimately pissed right now. It is upsetting how angry I am about this. So those were the positives. What else does Wortham have to say? Well, he's like any sort of moralist or conservative commentator when they talk about entertainment. Like what I said with the other two things, he misses the forest for the trees. He doesn't really have great media literacy. For example, let's talk about horror movies, especially slasher films. Now, generally, the religious right do not like these films because they depict supernatural hedonism, there's some sexual content, and some really big violence. And they're not wrong about all that. But oddly, what slasher films are usually saying are pretty conservative. Like, anybody who grew up after Scream, if you don't want to really think all that hard on the movies and media you watch, at least know the idea of, like, the virgin survives. Like with fairy tales, generations before, they all have, like, a conservative meaning. Fairy tales are written to tell kids who live in a rural area where there's a woods that you probably shouldn't go wandering into the woods, not because there's a evil witch who lives in a candy house that's going to eat you, but because there are bears out there and they'll probably eat you. It's just a good lesson to survival, though not all of them are great messages, like Beauty and the Beast teaching a generation of girls who are going to be forced to marry older men, or, let's be honest, sold to older men, and telling them that even though this guy seems like a jerk and he might be gruff and angry, with love, he actually just loves you deep down inside and will change. God, I hope someone got that happy ending of what was a horrible thing we did. But with slasher films, there is sort of an immediacy to, like, you have sex out of wedlock, you're partying, you're being hedonistic. I sound like an old man saying this. And then immediately a dude with a hockey mask is going to murder you, and only the, like, virgin survives. Like, arguably, the same people who hate the movies kind of believe in the same thing. And if you look at like a lot of religious media, there's something I don't really like it because I find it insidious, which I'm using a lot here. But like with Left Behind, so everybody else goes to heaven and they believe you're going to hell or you're going to live in a hell on earth. But they don't want to like say the specifics of what's happening. They want their cake and eat it too, which is a bad analogy because of course you're going to want your cake and eat it too. But they want to just have like a vague idea while also imagining what's really going to happen to you. They don't want to like outwardly say it, but they are kind of wishing horrible, horrible things. And I just find the slasher version way more honest. This is a wild tangent, but I have a thing for ghost shows. I guess they could be called ghost investigation shows, but specifically the kind of ghost shows where they reenact the haunting with local community theater actors. That is my drug of choice. And they're really fun at the beginning because before Christians kind of get their hands on them and turn it into Christian propaganda, a lot of different religions will come up and defeat dark spirits. Like you'll see an episode with Taoism or Wiccan. And then when the Christian propaganda starts up, it's only exorcisms and the church that can save you. In fact, Wiccans are, no matter what their intention, are servants of Satan. But there was this one episode specifically where this father spends the night in the bedroom of his two daughters where there's a dark spirit. So he records himself sleeping, and on the recording, there is a voice that keeps going, evil, 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 which I find is a lack of imagination. A study showing that having something repeated to you while you're sleeping, gathering information, is inconclusive or doesn't really work. So the evil spirit's going to have an uphill battle. But also, I'm pretty sure if someone just said evil, 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 evil in my ear all night, I'm just going to wake with evil happening in my brain. Not that I want to commit evil acts. It's just like evil, evil, evil. Man, this word is losing all its meaning. I should kill my family. Oh wait, I think that took a turn. Disclaimer, do not kill your family, and if I currently have glowing eyes and just repeating kill your family over and over and over again, you have a Pennywise problem. So you're going to have to talk to your local godlike turtle who threw up the universe so you can perform the ritual of Chewed. What's that? The turtle that vomited the universe is dead? How long has that been true? I loved him. Okay, don't worry. I know how to perform the ritual. You gotta bite the monster on the tongue and then make him laugh so then he'll be mortal and you can wound him. Now, you're gonna have to do this metaphysically, so you're gonna wanna invite friends that you have such a close connection with that you're basically telepathic. You can finish each other's sentences. You know what they're thinking. You don't wanna invite Gary who once helped you move. He only came over because you were ordering pizza. But we both know Gary isn't really that reliable. You need to invite your good friends. I guess this part of the video is brought to you by Stephen King's It. Read the book, maybe. You can try watching the different movie adaptations, but both don't really get into the giant turtle. The second one gets into the ritual of Chewed, but it's not this version. But after that long rant, he keeps complaining about comics with the title Crime Doesn't Pay, which then lead to a story where crime seems to be paying until the very end where something happens to them. And like, yeah, what do you want? Do you want like a consistent, instant cosmic karma? Like, should the moment I steal a packet of bubblegum or like a candy bar from a store, should I suddenly have a heart attack? Like, that's not how this works. It's also not a very interesting story if like every time you do something bad, something horrible immediately happens to you. You kind of have to build it up. It's like people who can't read Scorsese films. Like people who want to be Henry Hill and miss the entire ending where Henry Hill is living, constantly thinking that someone's going to find him and kill him, and he has to live somewhere where spaghetti sauce is ketchup. That is literally hell for that man. Or The Wolf of Wall Street, where you are upset that this guy doesn't get any real consequences that matter, but then you're sitting there listening to his sociopathic speech about the pen, and you're sitting there listening, and the camera pans over the crowd who are sitting there like in a movie theater, listening and hanging on to every word. And the projector looks like a camera as he's actively saying, the reason it's like this is that you still think the pen speech is a good idea. You want that money. So of course there's not going to be consequences for him. There are consequences. They eventually happen. It doesn't mean that just because sometimes there aren't consequences that we're not building to something big, but he has an issue with this. Probably the most infamous things he talks about in this comic is claiming that Batman and Robin are living a homosexual fantasy life. Also Wonder Woman, but that one's more fair. Though I think if I went back in time and had an honest conversation with Frederick Wortham, if I asked him to point out moments that were sapphic in some way, he would either point at a moment that wasn't sapphic at all, or he would be right, but if I were to have him explain it, he would be totally wrong. But he's not exactly wrong there, because Wonder Woman has a fascinating behind-the-scenes history. But we're not talking about that right now. Batman and Robin is weird, because there are some strange moments for the time. That's more of just like the storytelling at that time. As my favorite comic book writer, Grant Morrison, says in their history/autobiography of comic books, you kind of have to have a pretty perverted mind to begin with to think this about them. It's kind of like the big conservative complaint against homosexuals now being groomers just for, existing. It's not really their fault. It's more conservatives' faults for immediately seeing a gay person and only imagining sexual contexts with them. It's not their fault that you can't get gay sex out of your brain when you immediately see them. You should talk to a therapist. But you're not going to do that, are you? So, like, his evidence that they're living this homosexual fantasy life is that they like spend nights together, and by nights together, they're like reading on a couch, not even next to each other, reading separate books. Dick is probably doing his homework with a fire going on, which just sounds like a pleasant night. Like, what is he talking about? This is not evidence. Guys used to have clubs where they would just go and read, not even talk to each other. Am I done talking about this yet? Unfortunately, no. I have one more thing to talk about when it comes to seduction of the innocents. It becomes very clear why this book ends up being popular, because he's always giving a reason. Comics are the problem, but he's letting parents go scot-free for any actions. So at one point, while talking about a kid we're about to hear responses from, he mentions the kid has a difficult father. He knows it bears well enough to mention it, but then he does not continue to explain anything about this difficult father. And more upsettingly, there is several cases in the second half of the book he gets involved in. And one of them involves a mother of a teenager who murders, I believe, another teen. Now, he brings up that other experts, his colleagues, other psychiatrists, blame the mother. Now, he doesn't use any evidence of this, so I don't know how accurate that is. But he comes there and is basically telling the mother that there is no way her fault. It is all these comic books. And that doesn't seem helpful at all, does it? There has to be, like I said, there's many factors, and I'm really fascinated to why in this case, and I tried to look it up and I couldn't find much on it, that these other experts were pointing fingers at her, because I feel like there's a context he's ignoring and refusing to tell us. And there's other weird stuff in this book, like he quotes some studies that were proven wrong about how comic books ruin kids' ability to read in general. That's not true. I've been reading comics since I was a child, and I read a book a week. And in fact, there are many studies that prove just getting children to read basically anything and being excited about reading gets them excited about reading anything later in life. Or he starts talking about how like kids who read comics have poor grades. But this is at a time where like 90% of children are reading comic books. There are straight A students reading comic books. It's just completely, utterly ignoring reality. Unfortunately, as I said, this book becomes popular and there are consequences. And now I have saved the best for last as we come to the end of Seduction of the Innocents. Now, for a lot of this, and in fact, when I started writing it, before I had done some other research, I had been going off of all of the information that I've sort of gathered from watching comic book documentaries and history books, all basically before 2010. That ends up being important. A lot of this has been me being nice to Wortham, and you might not believe that, but I've been very nice to Wortham throughout this compared to how much I didn't want to be. Because I wanted to say stuff like, if we presume what he is writing is true. I did not say that throughout, even though I really, really, really want to. And here's the thing, I could have. Because in 2010, His original manuscript, including records and notes, was unsealed. And in a 2012 study, it was found that he indeed falsified data and evidence and rephrased a lot of what the kids said to him. Nothing in this book can be taken to face value. None of it is true. Even the part where the girl was talking about being affected by racism in comics. That's all written to sound better and further his argument. Remember how I said it was like the kids were saying what he wanted to hear? Yeah, he rewrote whatever they did say to be what he wanted to hear. And if any of you have taken this as like, hey, see, a scientist made up information, this is why climate change isn't real, you completely ignored my whole thing about peer review. His studies and papers didn't make it through peer review. This is why peer review is important. The staff at the juvenile hall, his colleagues, are all calling bull on this book and his papers and theories. The only problem is no one listens to them. Parents, the media, and politicians listen to Wortham. And this is where we get to the consequences. Because so far, I've just stated a lot of things that happened in the 1950s, but I haven't really gotten into why this is the Dark Ages. Well, due to the uproar that Wortham's book creates, the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency holds hearings on comic books. This is like one day, but it goes about as well as you think it would go. Wortham is called in as an expert witness when no one who is, in fact, the rest of the psychiatric community who are saying that his beliefs are nonsense, that what he's saying is nonsense, are called. And the only person who is brought forth to speak in defense of comics is William Gaines, the son of Max Gaines, who was one of the publishers of DC. He had his own comic book line, not affiliated with DC or National or whatever you want to call them, called Entertaining Comics, or EC. They published a lot of different comics, but they specialized in horror comics. Horror. Not horror comics, but horror comics. They were best known for the horror anthology series, Tales from the Crypt. Yes, that Tales of the Crypt. Except the original Crypt Keeper was just a guy in a robe who gave up, like, creepy vibes, and not a pun-loving, decaying puppet that I had an irrational fear was going to show up in my bathroom window wielding an axe. And for that to be true, he would have had to be like 8 to 10 feet tall, specifically for the framing, I imagine. Don't know why I was afraid of him. He had to have weighed like 2 pounds. But Gaines is called to testify, and this goes badly. Gaines thinks this is all pretty silly, and he's right. Unfortunately, no one else in that room thinks it's silly, and especially how well this goes, the rest of the comic book industry didn't take this very silly. He comes off nervous, because if you're called to testify in front of the Senate, you're going to be kind of nervous, but he's also a bit witty and maybe too smart for his own good. I should bring up William Gaines is in fact Jewish, and this shouldn't matter, but it's 1950s America, it 100% mattered. It's the very Christian 50s white Senate. So yeah, he's not coming off great, especially with how smart he is. The most famous part, the part anybody talking about this hearing will mention, is at one point a senator pulls out Crime Suspense Story. I've never been sure how you pronounce the title of that comic, issue 22, which I am hopefully showing you an image of, because there's no way to explain this image without you thinking of something that's entirely worse than what it was. So it features a severed head on it, and he's held this cover in front of him and asked if he thinks this is in good taste. Now his response is, yes, I do, for the cover of a horror comic. What he doesn't mention is that this is actually an edited version of the cover. The original cover was actually a lot worse. Now, this answer would go over better than my answer. Who are you to define what bad taste is? I didn't realize bad taste was against the law, which probably would have ended very badly for me, but it's true. It's absolutely true. That poor, poor brave man. So this leads to consequences. Now, the Senate doesn't do anything because this is all political posturing. It's political theater. But they kind of leave off on a threat that if comics don't do anything, they're going to come and do some censorship. So this leads to the comic book publishers coming together and creating the Comics Code Authority, or just the Comics Code, which had a lot of rules that they themselves held and censored books, though a lot of the censoring actually happened before them by the editors too afraid to stand up against them. And usually a book couldn't be published, though it turned out you could actually publish a comic without the Comic Code Authority approval. Something that when it shows up in the front of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse makes me laugh every time, because it doesn't really exist anymore. It died in 2011, but by the 60s and the 70s, it had been defanged. And that is a conversation for later. But what is important, it had rules about any sort of sexuality or sexual act or portraying women sexually. But where this ended up leading, because they were too worried about it, is a lot of like women who are not being drawn overtly realistically, or at the same time, not like a Playboy bunny like they would be in the 90s or starting in the late 80s and 90s, but like they would have just a simple line to represent cleavage, and the artist would get it back with the line erased. Because just acknowledging women have breasts is going to send a child into a murderous rage, I guess. An amazing feat of pettiness. Because Max Gaines bungled this so badly that basically anything you would find in a horror comic is banned. All those horror comics that Max Gaines was publishing have to go away, and EC Comics ends up shuttering. But do not worry about William Gaines. He would later go on to be the original editor-in-chief of Mad Magazine, really during the heyday of Mad Magazine. You have to admit he probably loved every little satire joke he ever did to a politician after what they did to him. But there was also some hilarious side effects to this. So due to Batman and Robin being called gay and the fear that they might be presented as gay, the overreaction to this that I am suspicious was done on purpose, because there's no way they didn't see this, really makes it seem like they might be gay. Like, to read into it before the hearings, it's a bit crazy, and you have to have a perverted mind, like I said. But afterwards, they're constantly saving women. Like, there's a lot of damsels in distress, like specifically 2 women for them to save. But because romance comics were big in the 50s, Batwoman is introduced. This is another chance to add more women into the comic book. And Batman has a will they, won't they with Batwoman. Not to be confused with Batgirl. That's Silver Age. The Batman TV show has to come about. But then they understood conflict. So Robin is worried that Batwoman's going to become Batman's new sidekick, and he's going to have to go away. He's going to be replaced. But in context, this leads to a lot of moments where Robin looks like he's jealous at Batman who's about to kiss Batwoman. Like, they had to have seen this right. This has to be on purpose. There's no way they didn't see this. It's just hilarious. This is also when Aunt Harriet is introduced, and Alfred is dead for a little bit. He's currently dead in comics, by the way, which I can't tell if like an older motherly character codes them more gay. It's maybe a unilateral move at best. So comics now in the 1950s are being censored. No one is happy. Due to the damage Wortham has done, they're not really getting the readership back. Comics are seen as this distasteful, horrible thing that will pollute your children. So you kind of have to hide comics from your parents. The writers are not happy. They're basically being forced to write milquetoast safe stories that they don't enjoy writing. And it's very clear the readership is not particularly fond of. There is some good stuff at this time. Like I said, Superman at this time is really crazy and outrageous that I kind of enjoyed, even though he's a jerk for a lot of it. Women can't be seen as being proactive, because Wortham complained about in Seduction of the Innocents about women, having jobs and not being homemakers. So like Wonder Woman becomes more of a romance comic, and she's not doing what you want her to be doing, which is beating up monsters. But also Lois Lane goes from this very cold-hearted, career-focused woman who is in love with Superman and takes dates from Clark, but that does not define her, to a woman who is constantly trying to figure out who Superman is. Is he Clark? I love him so much. And a lot of times, because Superman's written with like a 9 to 12-year-old in mind, like trying to trick Superman into marriage. And this leads to some hilarious stories. Like, context-wise, they're pretty bad, but They're enjoyable because of how it ends up being portrayed and how ridiculous the scenario is. But I need to make something very clear here, and this comes out, I think, best in a story that the great artist Neil Adams tells. Now, Neil Adams is just starting out in comics at this time. He passed away in the past 2 years. He was one of the greats, a really amazing man. He helped, with no experience, he was able to outplay DC and get Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster credit for creating Superman and residuals, which honestly, he deserves to be in Comics Hall of Fame just for that, but that would be excluding all his great comic work. Neil Adams tells a story that at this time he went to comic book publishers to try to get a job as an artist. One editor, after taking a look at his work, told him, "I'm going to do you a favor. I'm not going to hire you because in 10 years, there's not going to be a comic book industry." And this is really why it's the Dark Ages. Like I said, no one is happy. After things have stabilized due to comics being seen as a toxic influence and just the overall stories, it is losing readership. The comic book industry as it is after Wortham and the Comics Code Authority cannot sustain itself. It is going to die. There would be no comic book industry, even before I was born, if this had continued. Something had to change. And that something happens in the Silver Age. But that is a different video. So yeah, that is the 1950s and why I think it's the Dark Ages of comics. I know it was a long rant about Seduction of the Innocents, but you kind of have to understand Seduction of the Innocents to understand what came next. And what came next was not good. This is not a good era for comics. It just isn't. It is not a good era for comics where it barely survives it. So that is it for however long this video ends up being. I went on for a long time, but I am very interested in this, and I have a lot to say about it. I'm not sure how long the other videos will be, because they don't have as much in the way of moments. They're going to be more of talks of what's kind of going on with specific characters. Like, there's one big moment in the Silver Age, and then there's no real big moments in the Bronze Age. It's all like social and political situations that are happening at that time that's inspiring the writers. But that is it from my 1950s history. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching this. Hit the bell icon to get notification when a new video is up. I usually do one comic book a day where I cover a Superman story one at a time. And on Fridays I cover Batman. And maybe I'll cover other characters one day. So have a great day.